afternoon, sports fans, and welcome to today's lecture on the lasting influence of Greek and Roman sport and spectacle. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are wrapping up this course by considering the legacy of our main topics in the modern world. Now, some of these things are fairly obvious, right? Like the Olympics, of course. And some of them are less so, like the connection between ancient Greek sport and the development of victory prizes. Now, one of the things to think about as we go through performance, sport, and spectacle is the extent to which these things are really the same or different. So it should be pretty clear now that in many ways, these things exist along a continuum, right? That they are at least connected in some different ways, but maybe not exactly the same. Now, Greek sport tends to have more of an emphasis on the competitive performance of the athletes themselves. But of course, it had spectators too, even if some of them were thrown off a cliff for illegally watching the Olympics. And Roman spectacle, right? Although the emphasis might be on the fans rather than the competitors, well, Roman spectacle was undeniably a competition at its core. So any gladiator fighting for his life would absolutely say that this was a skilled competition with a substantial amount of athletic exertion. And nearly all of this overlap exists in the modern world as well. So even at the Olympics, one of the greatest parallels between ancient and modern, hundreds of thousands of spectators watched live in person, and millions more follow along on television. And our modern spectacles, you might call them boxing or MMA or NASCAR, are undoubtedly based on skilled athletic competition, right? So whether you're a fan of the past or you're looking to go back to the future, journey with me as we investigate the classical legacy of ancient athletics. So when we started our investigation into ancient sport, we saw that scholars from 100 years ago saw Greek sport as kind of the starting point and ending point when it came to sport in ancient athletics. We saw in this course that once you start trying to define sport, many of those characteristics, though, are present in a wide variety of societies that well predate archaic and classical Greece. So Egypt and the Near East had wrestling, and wild beast hunts, and monarchic displays of athleticism. And Minoan Crete had the always awesome bull leaping. But it is with ancient Greece that we get the formalization of sport as we know it. So something that was competitive, not just athletic, where there would be multiple participants and prizes and rules. And in ancient Greece, this starts out in the funerary realm, right, as funerary ritual. And we can see this in Homer's Iliad. And even its most complete form is still related to the gods, where we see the temple of Zeus at Olympia and the Pan-Athenaic festival in honor of Athena in Athens. Now, sport also gave the Greeks a way to train for battle, with events like the Hoplitodromos and the Pankration, while at the same time giving men an outlet for their competitive desires. Not only did this train for war, right, it also provided that kind of outlet for aggression. And it certainly trained men for more than just war, right? The training necessary to compete would have instilled discipline and helped build social relationships amongst those competitors. And that's not even to mention the specific sports themselves, right? So we of course still have the Olympics today, however different it may be. And foot races are just as popular today as they were back then. In combat sports like wrestling, boxing, and MMA, the new pankration, right, are all still popular as well. The ancient Greek pentathlon has its modern counterpart, which itself has spawned numerous knockoffs, right? The biathlon, and the triathlon, and the decathlon. And perhaps the biggest difference in terms of the type of sports between ancient and modern revolves around the development of team sports and ball sports, both of which were rare, if present at all, in ancient Greece. But the connections between sport and society are just as strong today as they were back then. So sport is still used to build social bonds, and it's still used as an outlet for aggression. In training for sport, it still instills discipline, and the respect of the body is as important today as it was in antiquity. Now, sport is still used for political reasons as well, and athletes themselves still hold a prominent role in society, just like they did in ancient Greece. And in the rest of this lecture, I'd like to revisit a few of these connections between ancient athletics, right? Between ancient sport and ancient spectacle, to look at the impact that ancient athletics have had on the modern world. So let's go ahead and take a look. So let's begin where we began our investigation into ancient Greek sport. That's right, the connection between sport and religion. Now, perhaps the earliest fully recognizable version of kind of quote-unquote sport in ancient Greece took place with the funeral games of Patroclus, with his best friend Achilles putting on these games full of rules and competition and prizes in honor of his deceased comrade. Not long after, we get the very first Olympics, right? Traditionally dated to 776 BCE, dedicated to the king of Olympus, right? Zeus himself. And that wasn't the only set of games that was dedicated to ancient Greek gods, right? So the Nemean games are also dedicated to Zeus, the Pythian games were dedicated to Apollo, the Isthmian games were dedicated to Poseidon. And those are just a handful of Pan-Hellenic games. We also get religiously affiliated local games, right? With the Pan-Athenaic games in Athens, dedicated to, you guessed it, Athena. And the very strange set of games in Sparta, right? Where those young boys had to try to steal cheese from the altar in the temple of Artemis Orthia. So yeah, in ancient Greece, sport and religion, they were inextricably bound. Now in the Roman world, those bonds are slightly looser, right? The chariot race is never associated with a particular god in quite the same way as the Pan-Hellenic games were. And the gladiatorial games, while they were early on associated with funeral games, never quite attached themselves to a particular god from the Roman pantheon in the same way as the Pan-Hellenic games. Nonetheless, the connections with religion persist. The ludi were often put on to celebrate and earn goodwill from the gods. And before both the gladiatorial games and the chariot races, you'd get the pompa, in which statues of the gods were paraded in front of the audience, and after which those statues would be moved to the host's luxury box to help preside over the contests and ensure fair play. Now, we've talked about how in the modern world, religion doesn't play quite as central of a role, right? Our Olympics are about nations more than they're about good old Zeus. But nevertheless, religion still intersects in several ways, right? So during a football game, you can see players wearing jewelry that signify their religious affiliation. And you can see them send up thanks after a touchdown. And you can see them thank God after winning the MVP in the Super Bowl. And in other ways, we've seen sport and religion collide, right? With players like Hakeem Olajuwon playing through his fasting during the Muslim holiday of Ramadan. And baseball players like Sean Green sitting out several games to observe the Jewish religious holiday of Yom Kippur. So overall, the relationship between sport and religion has certainly changed, and debatably, it's declined. But nonetheless, the relationship persists in new and varied ways in our modern athletic contests. So Greek sport and Roman spectacle also both have deep connections to the world of politics. And in ancient Greece, we see this most thoroughly through the Pan-Hellenic Games, which brought together city-states from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Now, this was particularly important because all these city-states were politically independent, and they'd often go to war with each other as much, if not more, then they'd end up teaming up to fight against outside groups. So these Panhellenic Games, just like the Olympics, right, provided a valuable venue to start building important political bonds between these independent communities. Now, on the Roman side of things, the spectacles, right, such as chariot racing and the gladiatorial games, they provided a crucial context to negotiate the relationship between the emperor and his people. I mean, these populations loved the games, and they gave the emperor an excellent chance to show his generosity towards his people. Now, on the flip side, they also gave the people a chance to share their feelings with the emperor. An organized chance could make the case for lower taxes or more holidays or anything else that people felt passionately about. Now, just like in ancient Rome, people continue to go to sport and spectacle not just to watch an event, but to see and to be seen. Ancient authors suggest that when you went to the games, you would go there to pick up good-looking guys and girls, similar to today in the courtside of NBA basketball games, right, lined with beautiful celebrity couples. And even though the emperor might not be at the Super Bowl, the president often does go to major sporting events. And they've also been the site of major political protests, right? This could be kneeling to advocate for African American rights. It could be the merging of North and South Korea hockey teams during the 2018 Olympics. That marked quite a major political moment there. Or it could be the American ping pong team, right? And their trip to China in the 1970s, which was crucially important to restarting political relations between two of the world's real superpowers. So while the political nature of games may shift, right? And while the world, and sports in particular, is more globalized now than ever, politics is still undoubtedly a major part of athletics in the modern world, just like it was in Greco-Roman antiquity. Now, the role of athletes in ancient Greece and Rome has also evolved dramatically over the last 2,000 years, right? So in ancient Greece, we saw that there's been a huge debate regarding who got to participate in athletics, right? With some arguing for sports being the domain of the aristocratic elite, while others contend that sports were democratizing, right? Putting people from different socioeconomic strata on the same level playing field. Now, regardless of the quote-unquote right answer to that debate, we did see that successful Greek athletes could win more than just money. They could win fame and prestige, both for themselves and for their city-state. And their victories could be commemorated for all time in victory odes written by authors such as Pindar. And the best of the best, right, the Theogonies of Thassos of the ancient world, could become veritable heroes, venerated after their death for the perceived power they still held. Now, in the Roman world, things were quite different. And the gladiators and charioteers of Rome's most famous spectacles were considered infames, right, or disreputable people. And they were frequently slaves forced into the arena to compete. But despite this official status as infames, gladiators could become incredibly famous, as attested through graffiti and literary sources. They were lusted over by women throughout the empire, and they could eventually win their freedom if they performed well enough, courageously enough, in the arena. Now, most athletes today aren't going to be venerated after their death because of their mystical powers. But the fame and fortune that can be won through athletic prowess is still incredibly substantial. I mean, Michael Jordan's net worth now is worth over $1 billion. And he is known worldwide, both for his basketball abilities and for his incredible marketing success. And many pro football and basketball players, right, they rise to that success in a way that might be more akin to kind of the Roman side of things here, right, rather than the Greek parallel, with many having endured difficult socioeconomic conditions, and then success in athletics gives them a kind of way out of that situation. And once in a while, you still do get mythological legends that arise, right? Just ask Babe Ruth, who called his shot, or Wade Boggs, who drank those 64 beers on one cross-country flight. Now, athletes today are more famous than ever, due in large part to the globalized world in which we live. And there's no hint of that popularity dying off anytime soon. So maybe soon we will get those athletes worshipped after their grave for the perceived power they might still hold. The architecture of ancient Greek sport and ancient Roman spectacle is perhaps the most visible legacy that's influenced the modern world of athletics. We saw that in the ancient Greek world, sports facilities were kind of more about open spaces than they were about monumental architecture. So the stadium at Olympia, for example, is simply a dirt track with marble starting blocks surrounded by grassy hillsides for seating. And the Greek hippodromes, right, the site of Greek chariot races, they were significantly larger, but very similar in terms of their layout, right? Large open spaces surrounded by natural banks for spectators. Now, it's not until the Roman period that the world of sports architecture kind of really becomes grand in a built-up sort of sense. So old Greek stadia often get a facelift during this period, right, with new stone bleachers to accommodate or accompany the kind of old Greek structure. And the venues for Roman spectacle, they're even grander. So the Circus Maximus was originally much like the Greek hippodromes, right? More of an open space than a built-up place. But over time, it grew in complexity. Julius Caesar added stone bleachers, and the Emperor Trajan built a grand facade, right, full of arcades. And under his remodel, the circus could fit at least, at the minimum, 150,000 spectators. An absolutely massive athletic facility. And the Colosseum was no different. So built in the 1st century CE, it housed the famous gladiatorial games in Rome. And inside of its 4 stories of archways, it housed 50,000 spectators. And it sat them accordingly, right, according to their position in Roman society. Now in today's world, we obviously have much more in common with the grandeur of the facilities of Roman spectacles, with football stadiums eclipsing 100,000 people in its capacity, and motor raceways holding more than 200,000 people. We even have a football stadium called the Colosseum, right, which hosts the USC Trojans. Now, why don't they call them the USC Romans if they're going to put them in a Colosseum? I don't know. I don't make the names here. But we do owe the idea of the community gym to the Greeks, right, who actually called it the exact same thing. So the gymnasion in ancient Greece provided a venue for citizens of all socioeconomic strata to train themselves, both physically and especially later on mentally as well. And our fitness centers that dot our modern cities, they certainly share a lot of similarities with that. So we absolutely owe a debt of gratitude to ancient Greece for providing us with places where everyone can train their bodies. And we owe a debt to ancient Rome for providing us with a model on which we can build some of the world's most impressive sports arenas. So if you've been paying attention to today's lecture, even just a little bit, you've probably figured out that basically the whole thing has been past meets present, right? That's the whole idea of today's lecture. Anyway, maybe the thing to focus on here then is not the sports themselves, but rather the authors who write about athletics, right? Think about how that has changed over time. In ancient Greece and Rome, for the most part, our understanding of sport and spectacle of ancient athletics comes from small mentions in a larger story, right? So it could be the story of the Trojan War, where we get the kind of mention of the funeral games of Patroclus. Or it could be the story of one man's trip through Greece, where we get a mention of what it was like to be at Olympia. Or it could be a comical reflection on love, where we get a mention of kind of advice for picking up ladies at the chariot races. Or it could be a larger story of the history of Rome, where we just happen to get a mention on some of the details of the inaugural games of the Colosseum. Philosophers at times, right, they comment on the utility of training in sport, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. But the takeaway point here is that for the most part, right, ancient authors reference athletics as part of a larger commentary on other societal issues. And this makes sense, right? That gets at the greater point of this course. Athletics in the ancient world was intimately tied to a wider variety of other aspects of society. Now, in the modern world, it took scholars quite a while to take something like athletics seriously, right? But over the past century, people have begun to investigate the role of athletics, not just in antiquity, but in our own culture as well. And through these investigations, we've seen the complex interactions that modern sports have with kind of traditionally more serious things, right? With things like politics and the economy and religion and culture and architecture and entertainment and so many other aspects of our world today. Now, in my opinion, it would be interesting, right, if we could see how ancient Greek and Roman authors would react to our own analysis of sport and spectacle in society, right? In the same way that we're now doing that, looking back at their thoughts on sport and spectacle in their own cultures. That would make for an interesting perspective. All right, you have made it to the end of another episode. In fact, you've actually made it to the end of the whole course, so very, very nice work. Now, in this course, we started with something of a paradox, right? That sports are kind of often viewed as something fun and lighthearted, and well, something kind of maybe rather meaningless in the bigger picture of life. But what we've learned in this class is that even though sports are fun and they are lighthearted, they're also kind of inextricably bound with all these other kind of traditionally more serious aspects of society. Things like religion and politics, like the economy and healthcare, like architecture and technology. And those connections exist both in the ancient Greco-Roman world and in our contemporary society. And in addition to all that, you know what? Sports really are also fun. They're fun to play. They're fun to watch, kind of at least when your team wins. And I really hope that you've also found them fun to study in this course. So thank you all so much for your hard work throughout this course. And best of luck finishing up everything. And never hesitate to get in touch with me if there's anything I can do for you. If you have any questions, whether it's about current assignments or future courses or letters of recommendation, I am always here to help you. So good luck to all of you. I hope you have enjoyed the wild world of ancient athletics.